We will move on to the panel now, and I think it'll be quite interesting to hear from all of the panelists we have here today, because they have a wide variety of experience and different angles in the way they look at information governance and RegTech, and that's what we are here to hear today. So Lynn, if I can start with you. Lynn is the Global Head of Records Management at Deutsche Bank, and she's based in New York. And one of the first questions that I would love to ask you is about the heightened focus on data protection. So there's an increased awareness, first of all, with customers, and there's an increased awareness with supervisors and the banks themselves that data protection is now much more important than in the past, and there are increased complexities around multi-jurisdictional records management. So how are large financial institutions ensuring the right policies and controls are in place to ensure this compliance?
All right. Thank you. And hello, everybody. Pleased to be here. Before I answer that question, I just want to actually share my perspective over the last several years leading up to this question. I was around during the 2008 financial crisis and how the banks and the financial institutions had to deal with getting what we call their houses in order to ensure that they have the right compliance with their records that they create, as well as the life cycle of ensuring that they face up to the regulators, that they have their processes and controls in place. I've been at Deutsche now for close to 4 years, in other institutions prior to that, and to this question in particular, I've never seen the complexities around and the heightened awareness on the regulations, and also from the standpoint of data protection in the new GDPR legislation, and how to deal with large institutions such as Deutsche Bank is quite difficult, but I can share some perspectives with you, having lived in this space for quite some time. I think first and foremost, you have to actually not look at your individual requirements in isolation of others. So using GDPR as the heightened regulatory requirement that companies are looking to adhere to, you still have to ensure that you marry that up to the thousands of other regulations that the company has to adhere to. And you cannot look at that in isolation of the retention obligations that you have to hold your records a certain amount of time, notwithstanding even the legal obligations of regulatory enforcements, as well as litigations that the company has to adhere to. You do have to apply a holistic approach when defining the rules, particularly with GDPR and data protection. You have to make sure you have a defensible position in place with the regulator, as well as the controls and processes to share to the regulator that you are looking at it in a global way, but also addressing it in the multiple jurisdictions that you have to actually manage too. Centralized policies and governance is critical. Working with all of the multiple businesses and functions in the organization, you can imagine how individual groups are trying to develop their own processes and controls to manage their data. But if you don't centralize the policies and governance around this, what you find is that you have a lot of local or on-the-ground people trying to do the right thing, misrepresenting the company's position on where we stand on managing the multiple requirements that you have to adhere to. I think critically, and I've seen this in all the companies I've worked in, if you don't centrally manage this, in other words, if you don't have an authoritative source that allows you to manage your rules across the multiple jurisdictions, as well as the myriad of laws and regs that you have to adhere to, you'll find that when you have to face off to the regulator or really come back and say, this is how the company's dealing with it, you won't be able to. Because what you'll find is that each particular business will do their own individual application of the laws and regs, and to actually, to the point that was raised earlier, how do you actually support the company with the technology as well as the overarching infrastructure that's needed to manage this company in a consistent way, it would be impossible, and it would cost the companies millions of dollars, euros, to actually comply to that. The last thing that I would say is that if you don't apply minimum standards and you consistently apply that across the globe, you'll find yourself, which is a carry-on to the last point that I made, you'll find yourself not being able to manage this in a consistent and compliant way. What I've found is that it depends on the data type, and it depends on the actual systems that you're trying to comply to or apply the minimum standards to, that if you don't have a set of guidelines that you're working towards, you'll never be able to make any kind of inroads in managing the global company around these particular regulations, as well as the complexities around managing it across the globe. It's just virtually impossible. So that's what I'd have to say about that.
I would, Debbie, if I may, can I just add one point to that? It's Ben Richmond here. Great. So yeah, great points, Lynn, and yeah, I would just add one thing to the last point that Lynn made around minimum standards. And I think given the complexities that Lynn was referring to, and given the clearly the change that we've seen over the last sort of 10 years since the financial crisis, and just the challenges both cross-border and in jurisdiction with the regulatory requirements and the complexity and the sometimes conflicting nature of those requirements, and then the advent of privacy that we now see today, which is really changing the way that everyone thinks about their information. The thing that we see that's so important, particularly for large, global financial institutions, is determining what the organizational risk-based appetite is. And so back to Lynn's point about minimum standards, defining what is the organizational risk appetite in terms of how the regulatory requirements are considered and how they are implemented, and to what level of conformity both globally and in country, and what does the organization consider as far as retain versus dispose, and considerations of the different types of regulation and legislation that exists, and whether that varies from a jurisdictional basis or whether that varies from a line of business perspective. And we find that those organizations that really have a good sense of what their risk appetite is, and being able to clearly define from that what those minimum standards are, really go much further in being able to simplify a lot of that complexity. And also, again, to Lynn's point, coupled with that centralized governance model and capability, I think they're two factors that really help deal with some of those complexities and challenges that we see today.
Brilliant, thank you. And Lynn, I just want to, I'm looking at the poll that Lucy held just before we started talking to you, and the overwhelming majority, 35% of the audience seem to think that being unable to evidence compliance to the regulator is a major challenge in terms of information assets compliance. Yeah. So how do we how do large firms deal with this evidence of compliance to regulators?
I think you're absolutely right, and I was answering that question to myself as we were getting the responses, and that was my answer, that is the biggest thing that you have to worry about. Putting aside the complexity and from around the technology, you have to actually confidently go in front of those regulators with full transparency of what the company in its current state can do to comply to certain regulations based on whatever the regulator is coming in and asking for. And what I have found is that you might not have everything in order at the current point in which the regulator is asking, but if you have a very clear roadmap in how you will get there, and convince the regulators that this is not just simply, we're going to comply to your specific question you're asking now, and then file the report and then address it next year when you come in, you get very positive response from the regulators. Having said that, I think Deutsche and a number of other companies are struggling, because when you try to to actually adhere to the multiple regulations and the complexities on how to deal with it, you really have to have a strong position and hopefully have that partnership with the regulators to say what is both the risk profile that the company stands behind in order to ensure we're compliant, but also what are the expectations of the regulators. And I truly believe that it's not a one-size-fits-all. I think you can come to an equal balance with a regulator if they feel that they are confident that the company is striving to move towards the right place. But that takes time, and it also takes a strong and continuous partnership with the regulators to show that you're looking to actually make your company into a better place as it relates to managing the complexities of all of these regulations.